an affiliate of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Leading in a New Reality in partnership with Jones. Jones is a company whose mission is to develop leaders and human systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. At Lead San Diego, it's our mission to connect, educate, and empower leaders for positive change. And that's why we're here today, to empower you as leaders of teams and organizations and leaders of families with the information and tools that you need to make change. Today's webinar is the second in a special series devoted to the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd and the protests and calls for reform to policing practices and systemic racism in our country. Last week, our guests Starla Lewis and Stephen Jones helped us to process this moment on its many levels and helped us to begin to think about how we can be part of the much needed change in our country. There were a lot of questions from our audience that we couldn't get to, so today is going to be really driven by your questions. Before we get started, I want you to know that this webinar is being recorded. We'll email out the link afterwards for viewing later on and for sharing later on. It's also being live streamed by KGTV 10 News, a longtime partner to Lead San Diego. The station's general manager, Leon Clark, who also serves on our Lead Board of Directors, is here with us and would like to say a few words. Leon, welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I just wanted to welcome everyone as well and let you know how important we feel here at ABC 10 that there are ways to communicate, have open lines of communication in order to start the dialogue in a very meaningful, intentional way, but also to remind us that we really have to be present and in the moment at all times in order to really understand what is going on. At ABC 10, we really foster advocacy for our community. We are the voice. We are who you expect to have really fair and balanced information brought to you every single day. So to be a part of this and to have Dr. Jones and Professor Lewis be the two that are really sort of like guiding us in this direction, I couldn't be happier for us to be a part of this today. So I say welcome, and I'm excited to really hear what we're able to talk about and hopefully bring about change.
Thank you, Leon. We appreciate your support so much and your investment in our community. Thank you. Everyone, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send us questions for our guests. My colleague and program manager, Kim Nguyen, is at the controls today, and she and I will try to get to as many questions as possible. I'm so pleased to welcome back our guests today. They are Starla Lewis, and she is Professor Emeritus at Mesa College and a transformational speaker and life coach who has developed lectures and facilitated seminars in the areas of diversity, life mastery, and women's empowerment, both nationally and internationally. She is the founder and CEO of CEL, which stands for Celebration of Everlasting Life and Love Consulting. Professor Lewis has more than 40 years of research and experience in African American studies, oral communication, and women's studies have enhanced her ability to engage diverse communities. Professor Lewis is a 7-time recipient of the Mesa College Teacher of the Year Award, a 2015 Women's Hall of Fame honoree, and was recognized by KPBS as a local hero. She is also a 1993 graduate of Lead's Impact Program. Welcome, Starla Lewis.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Stephen Jones is an author, national speaker, and the Chief Executive Officer of our partner, Jones. Nationally known as one of America's top experts on diversity, Dr. Jones holds a Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology and has served as a national diversity advisor to Hyundai, Honda, MRC Capital, and Sempra Energy. In addition, he and his team of consultants have provided consulting and training services for such organizations as the Getty, Kodak, Qualcomm, SDG&E, and Verizon. He currently serves on the executive committee of the board of directors of Lead San Diego and is past president of the San Diego County Black Chamber of Commerce. He is also a 2020 graduate of Lead's Influence Program for senior executives. Welcome, Stephen Jones.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be collaborating with my mentor and longtime friend, Professor Lewis.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Both for being with us today. Okay, we're going to dive right into questions, and we're going to start with a few that were sent earlier to us today, and they focus on communication. The first one is, how do we address or have a meaningful conversation about white privilege? I continue to read and hear about how important it is to recognize and acknowledge how our own white bias affects Black men and women, either directly or indirectly. I am a white presenting Latinx female, and it has been difficult to hear my white coworkers assume or try to impose that we are not doing enough to address racism. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I am feeling uneasy when I hear a white person telling people of color how to react towards these issues. Would you like to start, Dr. Jones?
Sure, sure. And also let me say, Leon, thank you for that warm welcome. Really appreciate the collaboration and the partnership with ABC 10. Very much so. Thank you. You know, privilege is an interesting topic because, one, I like to frame the conversation as what we think about as unearned privilege, right? It's the privilege that I get when I have done nothing to earn that privilege. And I like to use the analogy of, the idea of we live in a right-handed world, right? And the idea of there are many things that are set up for people who are right-handed versus people who are left-handed. Scissors, desk, gloves, baseball bats and golf clubs and 3-ring binders. And there are so many things, coffee mugs, there are so many things that are set up for right-handed people that as a right-handed person, I get to wake up in the morning and just exist. I don't wake up in the morning and think to myself, power to the right-handed people. The world is ours. I just wake up and I go about my business, and the desks in schools are set up for me, and the place settings are set up for me. And so I don't think about myself as waking up experiencing privilege, the privilege of not having to think or adjust. Right. And so the idea is when you're a part of a group that's in the majority, oftentimes your group's way of doing things gets built into the institution, made invisible, and just called normal. And that's part of why privilege is so mysterious to some and clear to others, because people who are left-handed oftentimes are, having to adjust or getting reprimanded for, when they were growing up reaching for things with your left hand. And so this idea of understanding that privilege is an institutionalized systemic concept, right? As opposed to, and it plays out interpersonally as well, but that for me is one of those challenges that as a man, I don't think about when I jog at night, whether my safety is an issue, or how in some of the ways how I interact with people. I don't think about certain things because my privilege allows me to not have to think about those things. Now, as a Black man, when I jog, I do think about it, right? So around being African American, then I don't have those privileges. As a man, I do. And so there's a level of invisibility to privilege that makes it hard for the privileged group to own their privilege. We have a great article called The Right Hand of Privilege that kind of talks about this and lays it out. And so I think it's that invisibility of privilege. Peggy McIntosh wrote an article called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of Privilege. And she lays out about 62 examples of the privilege that white people have that people of color do not. And so those are a couple of resources that are helpful to give to people to help them understand white privilege.
So first I want to share an African proverb because I'm so happy that so many people are asking questions. And the proverb goes, not to know is bad, but not to wish to know is worse. So I commend everyone for wanting to know and coming to participate today. I have an example that was given by a white woman who has a Latina daughter. And she was asking her daughter, what does it feel like what does it feel like to be Latina? Do you think people see you? And her daughter said, I'm a people. I see myself. And I think just in our terminology, human, when we think human, we think white people, and then we qualify all the other kind of humans. When we think, do you see yourself? We don't even really ask even children, do you see yourself? We say, what do you want to be, or what do you want to become, not who are you? And so I think part of the communication piece is really about being comfortable enough to ask people, who are you? You know, what is your journey? Before you jump into, how do you feel about white privilege, or do you believe in privilege, or what do you think it looks like? Who are you? And then maybe, what do you think about white privilege? Do you think it exists? How have you experienced it? Whether, no matter what your ethnicity is, we have experienced it. And I love Stephen's example of men, because men don't have to think about being a man and their safety, and can I take a night class, and will I get home okay? And, you know, or if I go out on a date, will she seduce me and then rape me and then, you know, say, see you next time? They don't have to think about that. And I think the privilege of manhood is as easily ignored as the privilege of being white, because it's unconscious.
That's right.
It's just the way things have been set out. And so we don't think about, oh, am I studying history, or am I studying a Eurocentric history? Am I studying art? And does my art book have pictures of people, all kind of bodies, or is just one kind of body in the art book? And so the privilege of just going to school and learning about yourself and your people and your history and your culture and all your accomplishments, that's a privilege that children of color don't have when they start school.
So I love those analogies, and this is a really good follow-up question to the one we just addressed. How do we start a conversation about racism with people that are in complete denial or so resistant to talk about racism? Those that live in a bubble and are so uncomfortable or afraid to talk. In the last few weeks, I was surprised how some of even my closest friends, conservatives and white, are so resistant to talk about our current situation or racism in general. How can we break the ice?
Yeah.
I think we had a great opportunity to just ask people, how did you feel when you saw this man being suffocated to death? What came up for you? Rather than racism focus, where is your humanity in this? What came up for you? What did you feel? What did you think? If someone says, I didn't feel anything, then they're giving you a broad stroke of where their consciousness lies. You know, if I can't see myself in other human beings being treated inhumanely, then am I really connected to my own humanity? You know, are there only certain people that I believe deserve to be treated well? You know, and it's hard for people. A lot of people who think they don't have any racism or issues never really come to terms with that until it's up close and personal. And a quick example. One of my best friends in college was a young white basketball player. He always dated Black women. His mother had no problem with him dating Black women until he decided he was going to marry one. And then his mother went into therapy, because we think we're okay with things often until they're in our front door or in our house, or we have to call them grandkids. You see what I'm saying? And so it's about levels of consciousness and unconsciousness.
Yeah.
And then even the why, because sometimes the why isn't racist. It may just be fear that other white people will now not hire you, my son, or might not promote you, my son, or not, our family might not welcome us in. And that's not necessarily the belief in racism, but it's the belief in the consequences of racism. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I want to build on your point, Starla, about who are you, right? And I think one of the first questions, I love your point around humanity, and did my humanity connect with the humanity of watching one human being right, call out and for their lives to another human being who did not respond to that humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And the who are you part becomes, before we can talk about racism, I think it's important to talk about what is our how does our culture and how does our identity and ethnic identity, racial identity, how does that influence and impact who we are? Right. And where are we taught, to your point, Starla, that U.S. history is white history? Oh, and then Dr. King marched, and Cesar Chavez, had a protest and a boycott. And so, and I want to give you an example of this concept of being taught and that invisibility of privilege connected to this. In my undergrad, I took a class on family studies, and the professor said, this is how healthy families interact with each other. And it said, they give their kids time out, they eat dinner together, right? And I went to the university about 15 minutes away from my home. So one day I took this book. I have a brother who's 8 years younger than I am, and I took the book home and said to my mom, I want to share something with you, because I thought I was helping out, And I said, Mom, you raised us wrong. She gave me a look. I took a few steps back. And I said, well, but look, this is what the book says around how families are supposed to interact with each other. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, Stephen, the smarter you become, the dumber you become. Right? Which to me meant the more educated you become, the less like me you think. So I went on to graduate school and was working on a master's in counseling, and that same study came up again. I had done learned some diversity training, did some work with Starla and others, and asked the question of the professor, what group was that study sampled on? And without missing a beat, the professor said, oh, that was sampled on middle-aged white people. And I said, but you didn't say that. You said families, as if all families interact this way, right? And live out these values in the same way. To that professor's credit, she came back the next class and had a list of family values of African-American families, values of Asian American families, that study, values of, and she had a list of multicultural family values. But her initial response was, oh, I'm not prepared to teach multicultural family studies. And I'm like, well, who are you teaching us about if you are not teaching about all human beings? Right? And so the idea is that I was being taught what was quote unquote normal. I wasn't being taught intentionally that this was the better family values, right? But it's the idea that white is better that gets normalized, and that's what people get taught.
Well, and I want to add that white families don't even act like that.
That's right.
So it's an ideal that we learn versus a reality that,
Mm-hmm.
and I say that because my first job was teaching Black studies at Palomar College in 1974, and I had no Black students. And I learned so much more than my education had taught me, because I saw how much more we had in common.
Yeah.
I saw how we might do things differently, but we're all doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're struggling in the same kind of ways. And we're all trying to find our self-esteem and our self-worth and all that based on all the different kind of ways that we have been treated in.
That's right. That's right. Dr. Del Wang Su has a great article called White Cultural Values. And he lists out some of those values that are common across different white ethnic groups. And I'm going back to how do you help people who don't view racism as real? And oftentimes what we will do is take that list of white cultural values and ask students in classes and leaders in corporations to answer the question, where have we institutionalized these values as our norm? And they move on to have that conversation. You see, it's hard to identify white racism if we don't know or identify white cultural values that get institutionalized, made invisible, and then creates privileges for people who were brought up with those values and have a common way of acting on those values, versus if people don't know their own identity. Then if you ask me, well, then what is racism? It's harder for me to understand and to get those concepts. Racism is the institutionalization of white cultural values as better than other cultural values.
Well, and I just want to say, for me, my working definition of racism is simply the belief in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to qualify that by saying, you don't have to be white to believe in white supremacy.
Absolutely.
And that if that value is taught in school, most children, by the time they graduate from high school or college, will have a belief in white supremacy. And it will be an internalized white supremacy.
Right.
And they will become agents of their own oppression. They're not going to need anybody else around to do to them what their mind will do to them, because we're really just talking about thought form. Racism is just a thought form. That's why I am confident that it can be relearned and unlearned. Right. And so if we get the fact that I am not condemning you to life for being a racist, you can say, oh, wait a minute, what am I doing that makes you feel that way? You can dialogue about it, and then you can self-correct from your own consciousness. How have I been a white supremacist? That's a question that I had to ask myself on my journey. And then I had to recognize it in my family. My parents desegregated a neighborhood in Altadena, California, because they thought my father was Italian. It wasn't even intentional. And then when my mother and I showed up, they went, oh my God, they're Negroes. So we had to figure out how to get through that. Then finally, other Black people started moving into Altadena. And then I heard my father say, oh, there goes the neighborhood. That's an internalized white supremacy statement based on things that society, education, media, etc., is teaching us. And so we all have to self-check all the time, or it'll come right out of our mouths.
That's right.
Can we talk a little bit more about education? I remember all the huge gaps in my education and just the things that were wrong. I remember, learning that the Civil War was about states' rights. And as a parent of 3 children, I often look at what they're learning, and then I say, you know what, there's more to the story, and let's talk a little bit about this. How can we as parents and citizens change what is being taught in our schools? What are the first steps that we can take with our schools and with our kids?
Well, you're all in my area now, because that's my whole life's work. My whole life's work is teaching people how to become truth seekers, which means that when you're presented with information, don't just regurgitate it back and pass the test. Think about it. Does this make any sense? Do you look at other resources? And I think that the reason I was Teacher of the Year so many times is because I allowed students to question, to do their own research, to self-discover, to go beyond what the curriculum was asking them to do. And some of their work, I used to call them KPBS specials, because they would do such amazing work. We're all challenged to self-educate. If you know you've been miseducated, and if you've gone through the traditional institutions, K through 12 and universities, you have, then you start to do the work. What did Lincoln really say? Not what did they say he said, but what did he really say? How come our Constitution never abolished slavery? Why do we think it's abolished? The Constitution's clear. Slavery is abolished except what? In the case of persons convicted of a crime, and then that helps us understand the prison industrial complex. But if we don't have those pieces, then nothing is connected. Our biggest challenge is to self-educate, to re-educate, and to know that everything, every experience is an education opportunity for ourselves and for others. And Stephen and I, when we worked at San Diego State together, and we did Summer Bridge, 300 kids every summer, we lived with them.
Right.
I had to just take a breath. We took them through self-work and family work. We took them through cultural work and getting to know themselves and others. We took them through male-female stuff. We took them through all these things. And in one summer, in what was a month, you saw such drastic changes in these kids because they had knowledge and information that they didn't have before. So the real key to everything we're going through, from my perspective, is we have to educate ourselves. The media is prime for bringing out knowledge and information. I learned just last night that George and I'm blocking on the white man's
Chauvin.
They knew each other.
Yes.
They worked in the same place.
Yes.
I'm like, what?
Yes.
See, that takes it to another level.
Right.
And so the more we know, the better we can formulate our ideas and our responses. Right. But if we don't know, our responses are, let's study race some more. We don't need to study it. We need to identify it, analyze it, and learn how to transcend racism. Because racism is the problem, because that's not real anyway. But racism is real. We have to deal with that. So how do we define it and then learn to transcend it?
Absolutely. We also, in our work with helping K through 12 schools figure out how to infuse multiculturalism into their curriculum, how to infuse cultural competency skills so that teachers have the skills to manage a diverse class, understand students. We find that in many school environments, there is a level of disempowerment that the adults feel in the environment, right? And so the idea of providing training and empowerment for the adults, and I mean faculty, staff, students, administrators as well, right? That is a key part of shifting the educational system. And then a number of, because this is not a short-term process, the need for schools to create a strategic plan regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it also involves getting police out of our schools, so and you know, using securities, because if students do what students do and get into, you know, disagreements and sometimes maybe a little pushing and shoving, or right, if that happens in some of our schools, a security guard deals with it, parents are called. In other schools, especially in impoverished or you know, marginalized communities, the police are there, and then those students are taken to jail, right? And so we've also got to look at, again, the school to prison pipeline and how I was working with a group of young men, and we used to play marbles a lot when I was growing up, you know, marbles. And there was this thing we had in Louisiana that was called slip is your shot. So if you picked up the marble and it slipped out of your hand, that's your shot, right? And in some neighborhoods, kids get to make mistakes. The marble slips out of their hand, and they get to pick up the marble, realize they made a mistake, and they keep playing. Right? They get to experiment with drugs. They get to experiment with lots of different things, make some mistakes. People go, kids will be kids. Right? In other neighborhoods, in other schools, kid makes a mistake. Their slip is they're now in the juvenile system. Right? And so the consequences for the same actions in our schools are disproportionately imbalanced.
You know, and I'd like to share, I had a student who lived in Southeast San Diego, had been stopped by the police many times, wasn't doing anything, never got arrested. He moved to North County. All his friends are now white. They're driving 100 miles an hour down the 52. The police stopped them. He said he knew he was going to jail. He said they set them on the side of the road, gave them a lecture, and sent them home. He said, I was so confused. You see, and to experience in one space one thing, another space a totally different reality, you know, and the language, we were talking about communication is so important. Black mother in Southeast San Diego is using drugs. She's a drug addict.
That's right.
White mother in North County is using drugs. She's chemically dependent.
That's right.
The language is so very different, you see, which gives us a different perception of what's actually going on.
That's right.
A grass house in Africa is a hut. A grass house on a hill in Europe is a cottage. Yet, you see what I'm saying? So our language has to be looked at.
Right.
You know, Ossie Davis, if any of you remember this amazing actor, wrote an article called "The English Language is My Enemy." And in it, he says there's 120 ways to teach Black children to feel good about white, and white children feel good about themselves. And 160 ways to make Black children feel bad about Black, and Black children and white children help them feel bad about Black. It's a big Black lie. It's a little white lie. I mean, we can go on and on and on. So we have to look at the language. We have to look at the images. I mean, I was appalled. I was in Walmart and I saw you could still buy The Little Rascals, one of the most racist pieces of children's literature ever, and it still exists. And parents are still buying it because they watched it or their grandparents watched it. So the next generation is getting fed those hideous stereotypes. You know, we have to look at that. I was amazed that Denny's used to be Sambo's. I didn't know that until I did the research. And I said, what? Denny's used to be Sambo's. And I, as a little Black girl in my white Girl Scout troop, went up to a beach camping, came back, and they took us all to Sambo's with a little Black kid on the wall and a little, you know, and I'm thinking, there's no consciousness that this isn't really like the best thing to do or understand. But you can't blame people for not knowing when they live in a society that disguises and hides so much of these kinds of things.
And you just grow up with it being so normalized, like, you know, watching Gone with the Wind. Like, how is that even still broadcast? I don't understand.
I love it.
And continuing on this theme of education, we have a question here that fits in well, because often people of color are expected to be sort of in the position of instructing white people on this, right? So how do we have these conversations without people of color feeling that they are responsible for that instruction and education?
I think we need to create opportunities for people of color to learn along with white people. And I say that because we think, oh, you're Black, you must know blah, blah, blah. But the reality is we went through the same school as you went through. We got the same miseducation. And so we don't know it either. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see in situations that we're trying to respond to right now is we find people who've experienced racism and we put them in the position to teach about racism when they've never studied it themselves. You know, I teach a class called the Psychohistory of Racism and Sexism. I created the class and I've taught it for probably about 30 some odd years now. When I hear other people who are just a person of color, whatever ethnicity, teaching racism, all I hear is pain. This hurt and that hurt and this hurt and that hurt. That's not going to get us past the pain. That's going to keep us kind of stuck in it and feeling sorry for each other. So we have to acknowledge the pain, but then we also have to acknowledge how to transcend it, rise above it, address it, heal it. How can we heal the pain? And that's what our nation, I feel, is at that precipice where it's saying, we got to have a healing. We got to heal.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that in many places, both corporate settings, education settings, and I'm thinking, Starla, about your example. We were doing some training in New York, and this one gentleman shows up, and he said he was really glad that this training session was going on. And I said, why? He says, well, I've been asked to lead my school's diversity effort. And I said, well, are you excited about that? He says, no. I said, what do you mean? He goes, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know what you're doing? He says, well, they just thought I would be the best person. I said, well, why do they think you'd be the best person? He says, I'm the only openly gay man in my school, and they assumed I would know.
Mm.
That I would know how to lead, I would know how to fix the system, to your point, Starla, right? And he was like, I have experiences, but that I don't have the skills necessary to drive this institutional change, to build buy-in, to help people heal, he says, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I think that's part of what happens is in many situations, to your point, Starla, people look at the person who's different and assume that they have the skills. And what we also hear is, and this is happening right now in a lot of places, that people are making spaces for Black voices, right? People are going, what do you think? And how do you feel, right? And we are hearing many people who said, wow, you're really listening to me now in a way that you have not listened to me before. Mm-hmm. Right, and the way you're listening to me now puts a spotlight on the way you were listening to me before. Because when I brought ideas up before, they were minimized, ignored, disagreed with, or just invalidated. Right, and so now there's this extra spotlight of let's see how Black people feel. Right, and it unfortunately gives light to the many situations where that is not the focus and not the case. And then lastly, we also hear people saying, I don't want to be viewed as the representative of my group. And oftentimes the problem is that people will go to that person when they view it as a diversity issue. But when they view it as an organizational issue, they don't go to that person to solve business problems, sales problems, innovation problems, right? And so it's kind of like if you're only going to that person for diversity issues, then you're letting the person know what you think about them and where you think their limitations are, versus in addition, and I won't say as opposed to, but in addition, going to that person to solve critical business, education, police, and other challenges that we face.
And I want to even add, even when you're interacting with people of your same culture, mm-hmm. who have been taught that certain areas have more status than other areas, the response won't be any different. I could be at a gathering and someone will say, oh, what do you do? When I used to say, well, I teach Black studies. Mm-hmm. And they go, oh, then they'd move on. Mm-hmm. Black people, mm-hmm. Or I would have a student say to me, oh, I can't take any more Black studies classes. And I go, why? And they go, oh, because I have all that I need. Mm-hmm. I'm like, how do you have all that you need? I'm still taking Black studies classes. You know what I mean? So there's a minimizing of not Black studies, Black things have the same status as Black people. And when we get that, then we understand that we have to move broader and bigger and beyond.
That's right.
I know that we passed a law in California to teach ethnic studies K through 12. Beautiful. Who's going to train the teachers to teach it? Because if you just let teachers have the book, it's going to be a mess.
Yeah.
It's going to be a mess of miseducation. There's a wonderful TED Talk where this man's son comes home. He says, oh, we had some Black history today. And so the father was very proud. He says, oh, what did you learn? He goes, well, I learned about Rosa Parks. He says, well, tell me, son, what did you learn about Rosa Parks? Well, she was this old washerwoman who was tired, and she was on the bus, and her feet hurt, and she didn't want to give up her seat. Well, that's a myth. She was 42 years old. That ain't an old woman. Mm-hmm. She was attractive. Mm-hmm. She was married. She was an activist. None of that stuff comes out in the Rosa Parks story for children. And so we have to educate people who are going to teach, educate people who are going to train. We can't just pick them because of the color of their skin.
Right. That's right.
Not to know is bad, but not to wish to know is worse.
Yeah. Elizabeth, we are also finding that a lot of people are saying, how do I support my Black colleagues? right? During this time, how do I reach out? We oftentimes like to say, if you have a relationship, an established relationship with people in your community who are Black or African American, now's a good time to check in. Just kind of say, how you doing, right? Given all that's going on. We also say, if you haven't talked to that person in 10 years and you call them now, I'm getting calls from people that I haven't spoken to in 5 years. And they're like, I just wanted to check to see how you're doing. I'm like, where you been for 5 years? Because I've been dealing with this for that entire time, right? And so what we are finding is so many people are saying, I don't know what to say. So they're not saying anything. And they're not reaching out. Just earlier today, we had an African-American woman in a listening forum who was in tears because she realized that the coworkers that she thought she had a personal relationship with, she said, we've talked about our kids growing up together. We've cried at life, tragedies together. And she says, none of them have reached out to me to see how I'm doing. And she said that really hurt because I thought that we had a human connection and had a relationship where if a friend is in crisis, or if a crisis is going on, an earthquake, a tornado, a hurricane, a fire, that most people reach out to check in on the people that they care about. Right? And she said, none of my friends reached out. And here's what she said. She goes, the part that was hurtful was, I thought we had a connection beyond our skin color. And she says, it felt like they were not reaching out to me because of the difference in our skin color. Right? And that for her was very, very painful. Right. And so this idea of reaching out and checking in with the people that you have those relationships with, and even if it's simply to say, I don't know what to say. It feels like a kick in my gut. I, am exhausted and overwhelmed and, shameful and disappointed and frustrated. Like to name your own emotions and then ask the other person how they're doing. Is what can be done to check in with. You don't have to have the right words. You have to have the right emotions. Mm-hmm. And that's back to the humanity that Professor Lewis talked about earlier.
And you have to be prepared to listen. Mm-hmm. You don't have to respond. You don't have to speak. You don't have to do any of that. But you have to listen. And sometimes listening is painful.
Yeah.
And so you have to be prepared to deal with somebody else's pain.
That's right.
Because sometimes listening, I teach oral communications. One of the things students do are self-speeches. And when the class has to sit over and over and over and listen to the pain of young Black men, because we don't often give them a platform for that pain. Mm-hmm. And so when you do, and the pain comes out, and it's not just racism, it can be whatever it is, but it's the pain.
Yeah.
And then to listen to the pain of women.
That's right.
Stephen knows we had folks running out of rooms and
that's right.
Couldn't handle hearing so much life pain that is real that we don't address K through 12. Right. Our children don't learn life skills in school, and they complain about it. They really complain about it, and so I think that's part of it too. This is our life skill lesson here. Right. It isn't that we have to fix it today. We have to acknowledge that it exists.
That's right.
So that we can begin the process of addressing it, because you can't fix anything that you won't acknowledge exists.
Beautiful advice. Really, really great advice. Is that what Dr. Jones, what you're telling clients? Like, why? I'm thinking about the woman whose friends didn't call. What kind of counsel are you giving to your clients is that the counsel you're giving to your clients who don't know what to say? Well, just call and share your feelings and your humanity. And,
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And we're also saying to leaders of organizations to run meetings as if the world is not marching and protesting right now. is borders on inhumane, right? This is not the time to do business as usual. That as you're leading meetings, to start the meeting off just saying there's a lot going on, there's marches, protests and marches happening in over 300 cities in this country, all 50 states, over 18 countries around the world. How are people thinking, feeling? How are you managing? What are you responding to? What's going on for you? And then giving your team a chance to talk about that. And I'm talking about an all-white team, right? I'm talking about a multicultural, whatever your team, the makeup of your team is, this is a human conversation, right? And I think that, to me, is part of what we are seeing. And then one other quick part is people go, how do I empathize? Because I have experiences of feeling invisible and experiencing pain. And we say empathy is about connecting with the same emotions that the person is feeling. It doesn't mean that I need to have the same experience that the person is having. Right? And so we say, if you want to connect and empathize, then if you see someone struggling, then to be able to say, you know what, I have felt invisible, I have felt diminished and seen people not acknowledge my pain, and then stop. Many people want to go on then to tell the story, because when I was this, or when I was, and then they start telling their story, which hijacks, right, the focus on listening to the pain that Professor Lewis talked about earlier, right, that Starla talked about.
Why won't they listen to the pain? Is it because of fear of acknowledging it, or they don't have the answers? What is it that makes them move on and not really create that space and for listening?
I think that they don't have an answer. You know, I don't have an answer for you. But often, even with our children, they just want to be heard.
That's right.
They just want a place to express it. They're not looking for you to fix it. You know, and often because parents are a perfect example. Often because we are so fix-it mode that our children don't come to us with the pain, because they know we don't even have the answer. They don't expect us to have the answer. You know, I remember my grandson came home one evening and he had gotten a videotape of a young man who had been killed by the police. And it was before it aired on media, because, you know, they've got their own media now. And he said, Grandma, I want you to look at this. And I said, Khalil, I can't look at that right now. I said, it's late. I'm getting ready to go to bed. I don't want that to be the last thing I see, but I will look at it with you tomorrow. But I saw him and his mother and my granddaughter look at it. And then he looked up at me and he said, it's hopeless, isn't it? Well, I couldn't stop there, because you can't leave them with feeling hopeless, you know. But my thing is, if we knew our history, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. You know, when you know the history of lynching in America, it's like, yeah. This is just their grandchildren's children.
Right.
You know, and if they weren't taught something different, their behavior is not going to be different either. Right. And the valuing of a life. I mean, the young man who was just jogging, and a man and his son, you know, run him down and kill him. I mean, you don't want to think, I can't even exercise.
That's right.
You know? But it's important that people hear that story, because if they don't, they won't understand all the other stories. Or the man who videotaped the woman in the park. I mean, that was such an important video.
Yes.
Because it's like, see, people are setting me up to be killed.
That's right.
Because they have that power and they know they have that power.
That's right.
That was such an important piece. I've had so many student athletes who lost their scholarships because their girlfriend, who was white, got mad at them and charged them with rape.
That's right.
Those stories aren't being told.
That's right.
All of our human stories, we have to tell them. We have to be open to hearing them. Yeah. And then we have to validate them for the people who are experiencing them. We can't tell them, well, maybe it was because of something else.
That's right.
They know what it was because of. You know, I had an Asian student in my class, and he had never shared this story ever. And so it was in my class, was the first time he shared it. And he talked about how he and his white girlfriend were in La Jolla, and how some young white boys came up to him and looked at her and said to her, "What are you doing with it?" Mm-hmm. And that it was his humanity.
Yeah.
And he broke down in the class and cried. And you could tell he had never told this to his parents. Don't know this story. His friends don't know this story, but somehow he felt safe enough to be able to express this. And then he later talked about how healing it was for him to just being able to say it out loud. Nobody tried to deny it. Nobody tried to fix it, but they heard him.
Yeah.
People need to be heard.
Yeah. You know, Elizabeth, Starla, and Leon, I think a lot about the conversation that many of us know Black parents have with their sons, with their daughters, with their children, about how to stay safe when you are stopped by the police. We call it the talk. And over these last 2 weeks, I've been thinking a lot about what's the talk that white parents need to have with their kids. What's the talk? Because we have a lot of people who are saying, I'm having to explain to my 7-year-old, right? Why didn't that man remove his knee from that man's neck so that he could leave? Why would he do that? And we are finding so many white parents who are struggling with how do I respond to that? And I would suggest it's a similar struggle that Black parents have around how do I explain this? And oftentimes when we work with schools, we hear from white parents who say, how long can I wait before I have this conversation with my child? I don't want to steal their innocence. And we have parents of color who oftentimes say, how soon do I need to have this conversation to protect their innocence? And so I think there's, in my mind, a parallel need, because to your point, Starla, we are all products of the system, mm-hmm. right? When they turned an African into a slave, they turned a European into a slave master. Mm-hmm. And both need detoxification, right? And unlearning, right? And so this idea of we are all part of the system, we are all infected with this global pandemic called institutionalized racism, systemic racism. Today, someone said in the listening session, they said, how do we get to the hearts and minds? And I thought, how about like interrupting the systems of racism? And I think that's why people are still marching and protesting today. The Montgomery bus boycott took 381 days before change happened. We're not even close to that.
And so it's important to know that right before the Supreme Court ruled, the state court was making, what do you call it? Oh, I'm blocking on the word. The carpooling, they were making it illegal.
Yes.
So even in the midst of, there's always the duality. Mm-hmm. So as we're moving forward, we know there will be resistance.
That's right.
Because we're talking about change. People aren't real comfortable with change. And even when change is going to make things safer and better and fairer and all those things, there will still always be some resistance.
That's right.
We have a couple questions on defunding the police. If you want to tackle that one, that has been something that has come up over the last week or two. Can either of you address that one? Like, how does that fit into what needs to happen, and what are your views on lowering the investment in police as a starting point?
Well, I think you pay people for doing their job. And so if their job is not to kill people, to harass people, to humiliate people, then those police need to be removed. Now, I'm not saying that they need to be fired. They need to be removed. How do they get their job back? They have to be educated. And in that education, they have to show a change in their own consciousness. You see, I don't think that the police officers that stood around were just bad people. they were in a culture, in an institutional culture that said you got to support your fellow officer. But I cringe at thinking about what they're thinking, about where their lives are now because they didn't speak up, speak their truth, act on behalf of right, those kind of things. And it's sad, but those are consequences of that. And so I think the consequences of police not doing their job are some communities are going to defund them, some are going to train them, some are going to retrain them. All those things are going to be taking place. And so I can't say good or bad. What works? If it works, then it's a good thing. Yeah. If it doesn't, then it's just another, exercise that we do to try to appease people.
Yeah.
But it's not just the police. It doesn't stop at the police. Then we have to go into the courtrooms.
Yeah.
We have to talk to the judges. How are the judges thinking? How are the prosecutors thinking?
Yeah.
We're a country that tries children as adults. What's up with that? Where does that come from? How do we figure out how to do that kind of thing to our adolescent children? So I think we've got lots of conversations to be had around, the police and the police training, because even one of my daughter's friends who is Latina was totally in support of what those police officers were doing, because the training is you're working in the jungle, you're working against, these non-human beings. They're vicious and they're this, that, and the other. And nobody thinks, oh, that's somebody's mother, brother, child, etc.
Yeah. There was an author that I saw interviewed on CNN who wrote a book called The Psychology of Riots. And he talked about how the media covers riots in a way that makes it seem like there's no rhyme or reason to buildings that are burned, no rhyme or reason to what is happening during the riots or the looting. And he made an important point. I think we talked about it, Starla, in our last session around, he said the riots are about power, right? And I think about kind of when we look at where and how are we impacted and affected, I think about kind of where our outrage lives. We hear some people who say, it's horrible that there was a Black man who was killed, but we have got to stop destroying property. And then we hear other people who say, it is horrible that we're destroying property, but we have got to stop killing Black men and women and people. Right? Where is the outrage? And that sends a huge message around where our priorities are. And I like to use a scale of 1 to 10. If our outrage around the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many of the other individuals, Ahmaud Arbery, if our rage level hits a 6, but then when we see a building burn and it hits a 10, I think there's a recalibration that's needed there, right? And I think that is part of the challenge around looking at, and let me finish that thought, if you will, around the psychology of riots. What this author discussed was using scientific method and research. When they looked at the patterns of riots, they found a lot of strategy and a lot of intentionality. I remember in 1992, Starla, there would be a building burned here, a store that was untouched here, a building burnt here, and a lot of it was based on the interactions that the community members had with the people in those stores and areas as well. And so by no means am I condoning the destruction of property. What I'm speaking about is the psychology that goes along with what is happening, as opposed to just a reaction that doesn't have a whole lot of thought attached to it.
And I want to add, our children are watching the news. Our children are listening to the dialogue. And as I was watching how different things were framed, I couldn't help but think of an Asian student that I had at San Diego High, who had been expelled for kicking a wall. He was a martial artist. He kicked the wall cracked, and he got expelled from school. And he was crying to me. And he was saying how much he wanted to stay in school. And he said, I didn't kick anybody. It's like, how can me as a person be less valuable to this institution than the wall that I kicked? You see, that's how our children feel out there on so many levels, in terms of how they're treated based on some objectification thing versus their humanity. How come you can't see my humanity and know that I want to be in school? And the way that our schools reprimand our children because they do something like they're late. And they don't know that they're late because there was some major tragedy that morning and then nobody asked. You were late. It's the third time, you're out of here, go home. And that kid worked hard to get there that morning through all of that tragedy. That's why we tell our stories, so that we can understand on a deeper level the motivations behind the behaviors as well as the behaviors themselves.
Thank you. It's time for us to close. Thank you once again to our guests, Professor Lewis, Dr. Jones, for just helping us think differently and connecting with each other. And just, we appreciate your wisdom and your time and all of your experience so much. Thank you very much. We'll be back together next week at 2 p.m. on Thursday to continue this conversation, but this time with a focus on San Diego. Considering our unique history and our culture, what are the issues that we should be focusing on here, and kind of what dynamics are at work here in San Diego? Our guests for that conversation will be Dr. Jones, along with former council president and RISE San Diego co-founder Tony Young, and South Bay community leader Nora Vargas, who is Vice President of Community and Government Relations for Planned Parenthood and a member of the Southwestern Community College Board. Please, everyone, thank you. Please take care of yourselves, and thank you for being here. Please look for the email. We'll be following up with some of the articles that were mentioned today and some of the resources that were mentioned today. And I love the messages of education and unlearning and re-educating ourselves. So thank you for those messages. Again, thank you for joining us. And on behalf of Lead San Diego, I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.